Her name was Amelia Rosewood, and the West had already taken everything from her: her husband, her savings, and her hope. Now, pregnant and alone, on a desolate patch of sun-scorched earth, she was one storm, one sickness, one bad man away from losing the only thing she had left, the life growing inside her. One blistering afternoon, she found a man bleeding out in the dust, a Navajo warrior poised between this world and the next. She chose compassion over fear, saving his life with nothing but stubborn grit. She never expected to see him again. She was wrong. The silence of the Arizona Territory was a living thing. It wasn't an absence of sound, but a tapestry woven from the drone of cicadas, the dry rustle of sagebrush, and the lonely cry of a hawk circling high in an unforgiving sky. For Amelia Rosewood, this silence was both a sanctuary and a prison. It was here in a small, sturdy cabin, built by her late husband's hands, that she measured her life in sunrises and sunsets, the swelling of her belly a constant, pressing clock. Her husband, Robert, had been a man with eyes full of golden dreams. He'd seen fortune not in the cards or at the bottom of a bottle, but in the earth itself. He'd sold their comfortable life back east for this 100 acres of rock and dust that he swore held a vein of silver. He'd dug for 6 months, his optimism a shield against the blistering heat and crushing disappointment. The shield had broken 3 months ago, not from a mining accident, but from a rattlesnake bite. He died in her arms, his dreams turning to dust, along with his body, leaving Amelia with nothing but the land, the cabin, and the 7-month-old secret she carried. Now her world had shrunk to the simple, brutal calculus of survival. Her daily routine was a liturgy of chores. Tending the small vegetable garden was an act of faith, coaxing life from the parched soil. Fetching water from the well was a slow, deliberate agony, the rope chafing her hands, the weight of the bucket a counterpoint to the weight in her womb. She rationed her dwindling supplies of flour and beans with a miser's precision, her hunger a dull, constant companion. She was utterly alone, a single flickering candle in an immense dark wilderness. The nearest town, Prescott, was a 2-day ride away, a journey she couldn't risk in her condition. Her only neighbor was Bartholomew Bart Higgins, a man whose ranch sprawled across the valley. He owned thousands of acres, yet his eyes, small and greedy like a pig's, were fixed on her small plot. Robert had told her the stream on their land was the only reliable water source for miles, a fact Higgins was bitterly aware of. He'd made a paltry offer for the land after Robert's funeral, his condolences as thin as watered-down whiskey. Amelia had refused. His smile had curdled, and the look he'd given her then had made the hairs on her arms stand up. This afternoon, the heat was a physical weight. The sun beat down, bleaching the color from the landscape, leaving only shades of beige and brown. Amelia stood on her porch, one hand resting on the small of her back, the other shielding her eyes as she scanned the horizon. A flicker of movement caught her eye down near the dry creek bed that marked the edge of her property. It wasn't the familiar gait of a coyote or the slow amble of a deer. It was erratic, a lurching, stumbling motion that bespoke injury and desperation. Caution warred with a deeper, more primal instinct. To be a woman alone in this land was to be perpetually wary. Every stranger was a potential threat. But the figure collapsed a dark shape against the pale ground and didn't move again. It could be a trick. It could be a drunkard from some distant saloon. Or it could be someone dying. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Robert would have gone without a second thought, his goodness as vast and simple as the sky. She was not Robert. She was a survivor, and her first duty was to the unborn child who depended on her for everything. She went inside her hand, finding the cold, heavy comfort of the old Winchester rifle Robert had taught her to use. She didn't load it to fire, not yet, but its presence was a steadying force. Taking a canteen of water, she moved with a slowness that belied the urgency thrumming through her veins. The heat radiated from the ground in shimmering waves. As she drew closer, the shape resolved into a man. He was Navajo, that much was clear from the high cheekbones, the long dark hair matted with blood and dirt, and the simple leather leggings he wore. He was lying face down, a dark, viscous pool spreading from beneath his torso. A brutal gash, long and jagged, ran across his back, torn open as if by a claw or something worse. His breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. The stories were rife with conflict tales of raids and retribution. The white settlers and the Navajo, the Dine, as they called themselves, lived in a state of fragile, often broken peace. To help this man was to invite danger from every direction. If his tribe found him here, they might assume she was the cause of his wounds. If white men like Bart Higgins found her harboring a Navajo warrior, the consequences would be swift and terrible. They would call her a traitor, an accomplice, and worse. She knelt beside him, the rifle laid carefully on the ground, within reach. She gently pressed 2 fingers to his neck. The pulse was there, a faint, thready flutter, a desperate bird trapped in a cage of failing flesh. He was young, perhaps no older than 20. His face, even slack with unconsciousness, held a fierce, proud beauty. A small, intricately beaded amulet lay half buried in the dust near his hand. In that moment, the calculus of survival shifted. She saw not a Navajo, not a threat, but a human being whose life was draining into the thirsty earth. She saw a mother's son, and her hand instinctively went to her own belly. To leave him here would be to abandon a part of her own humanity. It was a line she could not cross. The decision made a strange calm settled over her. The monumental task ahead pushed aside the fear. He was too heavy to carry. She had to get him to the cabin 100 yards that might as well have been a mile. She uncorked the canteen and gently moistened his cracked lips, then dribbled a little water onto the back of his neck. He stirred, a low groan escaping his throat. Easy now, she whispered the words, swallowed by the vast silence. I'm not going to hurt you. She retrieved the wheelbarrow she used for firewood. It groaned under his weight as she managed with a strength born of pure adrenaline to roll him over and heave his upper body into the basin. His legs dragged behind, scarring the earth. Every push of the wheel was a grunt of effort, her back screaming in protest, the baby inside her shifting as if in sympathy. The short journey back to the cabin was an eternity. The sun beat down. The silence mocked her. By the time she dragged him over the threshold and onto the cool dirt floor, she was trembling, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. She had crossed the line. There was no going back. The warrior was inside her home, his life in her hands, and whatever storm was coming, she was now standing directly in its path. The inside of the cabin offered little respite from the oppressive heat, but it was a fortress of shadow against the sun's glare. Amelia barred the door, the heavy wooden plank sliding into place with a sound of finality. For a moment she leaned against it, her body shaking with a mixture of exertion and terror. The man lay on the floor, a still dark form, his labored breathing filling the small space. He was a piece of the wild, dangerous world she had just dragged inside, and the full weight of her decision began to settle upon her. Her first priority was the wound. Robert had left behind a small chest of medical supplies, bandages, carbolic acid, and a few surgical needles intended for stitching up livestock, but which he'd used on himself more than once after a mishap. She tore away the shredded leather of the man's tunic. The gash was worse than she had imagined. It ran from his left shoulder blade down towards his kidney, deep and cruelly torn. It wasn't a knife or a bullet wound. The edges were ragged, shredded. It looked like the work of a bear. There were other injuries, 2 deep bruises mottling his ribs, and a nasty contusion on his temple, where his head had likely struck a rock. He was feverish, his skin hot and dry to the touch. Infection was the real enemy now, a silent killer that stalked the wounded in this land without mercy. Working with a frantic efficiency, she set a pot of water to boil over the hearth. From a small leather pouch, she took a handful of dried yarrow, a bitter herb her grandmother had sworn by to staunch bleeding and fight off putrefaction. She crushed the leaves and stems, the pungent, earthy smell filling the cabin. This was the extent of her medical knowledge, a patchwork of folk remedies and practical frontier scents. It would have to be enough. Cleaning the wound was a grim, stomach-turning task. She bit her lip, forcing herself to be methodical, as she wiped away the dirt and congealed blood with cloths soaked in the hot, yarrow-infused water. The man flinched and groaned, his body tensing, but he did not wake. His resilience was astonishing. Most men would have already died from shock and blood loss. As she worked, she studied him. His features were strong, carved as if from the red rock of the canyons themselves. A single feather was tied into his long black hair, its tip dyed a stark crimson. Despite the grime and blood, there was a dignity to him, an aura of coiled strength that even unconsciousness could not fully erase. Who was he? What had happened to him out there? Had he been hunting, or had he been hunted? The thought sent a fresh chill of fear through her. If he was a man of importance, his people would be looking for him. What would they think when they found his trail leading to her door? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp, authoritative knock. Amelia froze, her blood turning to ice. The cloth in her hand dripped red onto the floorboards. She looked from the unconscious man to the barred door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. No one ever knocked. Mrs. Rosewood. A man's voice boomed, thick with impatience. I know you're in there. Saw the smoke from your chimney. It was Bart Higgins. She quickly threw a clean blanket over the Navajo, hiding him from view. She wiped her hands on her apron, trying to still their trembling, and took a deep breath before sliding the bar back. She opened the door just a crack, blocking the view inside with her body. Higgins stood on her porch, his bulk seeming to swallow the afternoon light. He was a big man running to fat, with a florid face and a thin, cruel mouth. He took off his hat, revealing a scalp beaded with sweat, and wiped his brow with the back of his hand. His small eyes darted past her, trying to peer into the cabin's gloom. Afternoon, Mrs. Rosewood, he said, his voice a mockery of politeness. Just checking on my neighbor. It's a hard country for a woman alone, especially a woman in your condition. His gaze dropped pointedly to her swollen abdomen, and a smirk played on his lips. I'm managing just fine, Mr. Higgins. Amelia replied, her voice cool and steady, despite the storm raging inside her. What do you want, just being neighborly? He repeated, his eyes still trying to penetrate the shadows behind her. Things go missing out here. Livestock, supplies, sometimes people. You hear stories. Apache Navajo. They get bold sometimes. Best to have a man around, a man who knows how to handle things. The insinuation was as thick and foul as swamp mud. He was the danger, not some imagined raider. He was the wolf circling her homestead. I have my husband's rifle, she said, her chin held high, and I know how to use it. I'm not in need of any help. Higgins's smile vanished. That little plot ain't worth dying over, Mum. My offer still stands. Cash money. You could be back east in a comfortable room before that baby comes, instead of stuck out here waiting for a snake or a savage to finish what the wilderness started. This was my husband's land, she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. It's my land now, and it's not for sale. Not to you. Not ever. A flicker of raw anger crossed his face. He took a half step forward, and for a terrifying second she thought he would push his way inside. From the floor behind her, a low moan escaped the blanket-covered form. Higgins's head cocked. What was that? Amelia's mind raced. My goat, she lied, the word tasting like ash. She's unwell. He stared at her. His eyes narrowed in suspicion. He clearly didn't believe her, but he couldn't prove otherwise without forcing his way in, and even he wasn't brazen enough for that. Not yet. You watch yourself, Mrs. Rosewood, he said, his voice low and menacing. This land has a way of swallowing up people who don't belong, especially stubborn ones. He clapped his hat back on his head, turned and stomped off the porch. Amelia watched him ride away his broad back, a symbol of the suffocating threat he posed. Only when he was a small dot on the horizon did she dare to shut and bar the door again. She collapsed against it, her legs finally giving way. The close call had shredded her nerves. Higgins was no longer just a greedy nuisance. He was an active threat. He suspected something, and he would be watching her now. She crawled back to the warrior's side and pulled back the blanket. His eyes were open. They were dark, fathomless pools, clouded with fever but lucid. He was looking at her, a silent, questioning gaze. He had heard. He knew the danger she had just faced for him. His gaze flickered to the bloody wound on his back, then back to her face. He didn't speak, perhaps he couldn't, or perhaps he knew no English. But in that look, a universe of understanding passed between them. He knew she was protecting him, and he knew it was costing her dearly. Amelia simply nodded a gesture of reassurance. She dipped a cloth in the cool water from the bucket and gently wiped his forehead. His fever was still raging. The fight for his life, and now for hers, had only just begun. Higgins's visit had changed everything. It was no longer a matter of simple compassion. It was now a conspiracy, a shared secret sealed in blood and water, with a common enemy looming just beyond the horizon. The days that followed bled into one another, marked by the rising and setting of a relentless sun. The cabin became a world unto itself, a pocket of shared existence, suspended in the vast, indifferent wilderness. The man's fever was a stubborn, malevolent fire. For 3 days he drifted in and out of consciousness, his sleep troubled by nightmares that made him cry out in a language Amelia didn't understand, his words sharp and guttural, like stones striking rock. During these periods, Amelia was his constant attendant. She bathed his face with cool, water-forced sips of willow bark tea between his lips to fight the fever, and kept his wound clean. She spoke to him in low, soothing tones, not caring if he understood the words. The sound of a human voice, she reasoned, was a comfort in itself. She told him about Robert, about their dreams, about the baby that kicked and rolled inside her. She spoke of her fears, of the suffocating loneliness, of the hulking shadow of Bart Higgins. The unconscious man became her confessor, the silent keeper of her secrets. Her own existence was pared down to a sliver. She ate little, her appetite stolen by anxiety. Sleep came in brief, fitful snatches, in a chair by the hearth, one ear always tuned to his breathing. Her world was the smell of herbs and blood, the heat of the fire, and the rasp of his fight for life. On the 4th day the fever broke. Amelia woke from a shallow doze to find him watching her, his dark eyes clear and calm for the first time. The inferno had passed, leaving an exhausted, fragile peace in its wake. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, his movements slow and deliberate. She rushed to his side with a cup of broth. "Easy now," she cautioned. "You've been very sick." He took the cup his hand, surprisingly steady, and drank. He nodded his thanks, a simple, profound gesture. A language began to form between them, one built not of words but of actions and expressions. A nod of gratitude, a shared look of concern when the water bucket ran low. A small, almost imperceptible smile from him when she winced at a particularly strong kick from the baby. She learned he was a man of immense patience and observation. He watched her every move as she went about her chores, his eyes missing nothing. He saw the way she favored her aching back, the difficulty she had bending down. One morning, she struggled to lift a heavy log for the fire. Before she could try a second time, he was on his feet, swaying slightly from weakness, and took the log from her. He placed it on the hearth with an ease that belied his recent brush with death. He did not speak, but the message was clear. "Let me help." He began to mend his body's recovery, as swift and silent as his movements. He would whittle small, intricate figures from scraps of wood. A hawk, a coyote, a horse, each one perfect in its detail. He gave them to her as gifts, placing them on the mantelpiece without ceremony. They were his words, his thanks. She learned his name, or something like it. One afternoon, while pointing to her own chest and saying, "Amelia," she then pointed to him. He was silent for a long moment before touching his own chest and speaking a single soft word, Taz. It was likely a shortened version of a more complex name, but it was a start. It was an identity. Taz. The fragile piece of their shared solitude was shattered a week later. Amelia went to the well for their morning water, a task Taz had tried to take from her, but which she insisted on doing herself, clinging to the remnants of her self-sufficiency. As the bucket came up, she noticed the water looked wrong. It was cloudy, with a faint, oily sheen on the surface. A bitter chemical smell rose from it. Her blood ran cold. She dropped the bucket, the contaminated water splashing across the dry ground. She knew with a certainty that settled like a stone in her gut what this was. Bart Higgins. Unable to scare her away with threats, he had resorted to a more insidious tactic. He had poisoned her well. He was trying to choke her out to make her land unlivable. She ran back to the cabin, her breath coming in panicked sobs. Taz was on his feet the moment she burst through the door, his eyes sharp with alarm. She didn't need words to explain. He saw the terror on her face, saw the empty water pail, and understood. He went to the door and looked out towards the well, his expression hardening into a mask of cold fury. He then turned to their dwindling water barrel inside the cabin, which held perhaps a day's supply. His gaze shifted from the barrel to her swollen belly. The strategic implications were immediately clear to him. Without water, they could not survive. Without water, she and her unborn child were doomed. For the first time since his arrival, he seemed to forget his own injuries. He moved with a new purpose, a hunter's focus. He checked the Winchester rifle, his hands moving with practiced familiarity. He tested the weight of Robert's old axe. He was preparing for a fight. But Amelia knew a direct confrontation with a man like Higgins was suicide. Higgins had money men and the implicit backing of a society that saw Taz as less than human. "No," she said, placing a hand on his arm. His muscles were like steel cables beneath her touch. "No fighting. We can't win that way." He looked at her, his dark eyes, questioning her strategy. How could they not fight? Their very lives were on the line. "We have to be smarter," she insisted, her mind racing. The stream that was the source of all the conflict, the one Robert had said was so reliable. It was a half-mile walk, a dangerous trek in her condition, but it was their only hope. She pointed out the window towards the line of cottonwood trees that marked the stream's path. Water. She said the single word, holding all of their hope. Taz looked where she was pointing, then back at the poisoned well. He understood the plan and the risks. He gave a single sharp nod. The unspoken agreement passed between them. Higgins had meant to isolate and destroy her, but his cruelty had an unintended consequence. It had forged an alliance. In poisoning her well, he had not only declared war on Amelia, but on the warrior she had saved. And Taz was not a man who would allow his debts to go unpaid. The journey to the stream became their new perilous routine. They went only once in the grey light of dawn, when the shadows were long and the world was still asleep. Taz would lead the way, moving with a predator's grace, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, the Winchester held loosely in his hands. Amelia followed, carrying 2 empty buckets, her steps heavy, her breath short. The half-mile felt like 10 each trip, a small victory against Higgins's siege. The stream was a lifeline, a silver ribbon of clear, cold water carving its way through the dry land. While Amelia rested, Taz would stand guard, a silent, unmoving sentinel. He never relaxed. He was a coiled spring, his senses attuned to the slightest sound, the slightest shift in the wind. He was protecting her not just out of gratitude, but with a fierce possessiveness that both frightened and comforted her. Their bond deepened in the crucible of this shared hardship. They still rarely spoke, but their silence was rich with meaning. He would leave a piece of jerky by her plate when he saw she hadn't eaten. She would mend a tear in his leggings while he was out scouting their perimeter. They were 2 solitary souls trapped in a dangerous dance, their survival inextricably linked. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the sky, Taz indicated that he was finally healed. His wounds were scarred over his strength, fully returned. He motioned to the mountains, a distant hazy silhouette to the east, his home. It was time for him to leave. A pang of desolation, sharp and unexpected, struck Amelia. She had grown accustomed to his presence, to the quiet companionship, to the sense of safety he provided, despite the danger he represented. The thought of being truly alone again with Higgins, lurking like a vulture, was terrifying. He stood before her in the dim light of the cabin. He had gathered nothing, for he had nothing to gather. He simply was. He met her gaze, and for the first time she saw something beyond gratitude in his eyes, a deep, profound respect. He reached up and gently untied the single crimson-tipped feather from his hair. It was his only adornment, a part of his identity. He held it out to her, placing it in her palm. Her fingers closed around the smooth quill, the soft barbs. It was a promise, a symbol. It was his word given form. Then, as silently as he had come into her life, he was gone. She stood at the open door and watched him disappear into the twilight, his form melting into the landscape as if he were a part of it. The cabin felt cavernous, the silence no longer a comfort, but a hollow ache. The feather was a small, fragile weight in her hand. The next 2 weeks were the longest of Amelia's life. Her pregnancy was in its final, burdensome stage. Her body ached, and every chore was a monumental effort. The trips to the stream became nearly impossible, leaving her exhausted and faint. Loneliness was a physical presence, a cold ghost that sat with her at her meager meals. And the fear of Higgins was a constant gnawing acid in her stomach. The fear was justified. One afternoon, Higgins rode up not to her porch, but to the edge of her tilled garden. He didn't dismount his horse, stomping impatiently its presence, an extension of his own arrogant power. 2 other men were with him, hard-faced men with rifles resting across their saddles. Last chance, Mrs. Rosewood Higgins shouted his voice, carrying easily in the still air. He didn't bother with false pleasantries this time. "I have a deed of sale right here. You sign it, and I'll give you $500 and a wagon ride to Prescott. You refuse, and I can't be responsible for what might happen. A fire, maybe. Fires are common out here, especially with this dry wind." Amelia stood on her porch, her hand resting on her belly, Robert's rifle, leaning against the wall beside her. She was terrified, but a cold, hard rage burned through the fear. This was her home. This was her son's or daughter's birthright. "Get off my land, Mr. Higgins," she said, her voice shaking but clear. Higgins laughed a harsh, ugly sound. Wrong answer. He looked at the sky. "Storm's coming in tonight. Big one. A lightning strike could burn this whole place to the ground. Be a shame. You have until morning. By sunrise, either you'll be gone, or your house will be." He wheeled his horse around and rode off his men, following like jackals behind him. The threat was no longer veiled. It was a promise. He would burn her out, using the cover of the coming storm as his excuse. As dusk fell, the sky began to bruise. The wind picked up, howling around the corners of the cabin, rattling the window frames. The first distant rumble of thunder echoed through the valley, and inside, Amelia, a different kind of storm was beginning. A low, clenching pain gripped her back. It radiated through her belly, stealing her breath. She gasped, leaning against the table for support. It was too soon. It wasn't time. But the stress, the fear, the weeks of hardship had taken their toll. The baby was coming. The pains began to come faster, harder. She was alone, trapped. A violent storm was bearing down on her from the heavens. A malevolent man was preparing to unleash his own fire and fury, and the child inside her was fighting its way into a world determined to destroy them both. She stumbled to her bed, sweat beading on her forehead, a scream of pain and despair torn from her lips as another contraction seized her. She clutched the feather Taz had given her, its fragile form, the only anchor in a universe that was violently, terrifyingly coming apart. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of pain and sound. Outside, the storm broke with apocalyptic fury. Rain lashed against the roof in solid sheets, driven by a wind that shrieked like a banshee. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the cabin in stark, terrifying flashes, followed instantly by cracks of thunder that shook the very foundations of the small house. Inside, Amelia's body was a storm of its own, each contraction a wave of agony that crested and broke, leaving her gasping and trembling in its wake. Time lost all meaning. There was only the rhythm of pain, the roar of the wind, and the suffocating certainty of her own doom. She was going to die here. She and her baby would perish in this lonely cabin, either by the violence of the birth or the fire of Bart Higgins. She cried out Robert's name, a raw, desperate plea to a ghost. She clutched the feather from Taz, its delicate structure, a stark contrast to the brutal forces tearing her world apart. Through the haze of her suffering, she heard a new sound, a splintering crash from the direction of the small barn, where her goat and 2 chickens were sheltered. It was followed by a flicker of orange light that danced and grew against the window pane, a hellish glow cutting through the storm's darkness. Higgins. He had kept his promise. A surge of primal protective rage cut through her pain. He wasn't just trying to drive her out. He was trying to burn her alive. Using the last of her strength, she tried to pull herself from the bed to reach the rifle to make one final defiant stand. But another contraction, more powerful than any before, slammed into her, pinning her to the sweat-soaked sheets. A scream was ripped from her throat, a sound of pure animalistic torment. It was in that moment, at the absolute nadir of hope, that the sound of the world changed again. Over the howl of the wind and the roar of the fire, another sound emerged, a high, piercing cry that was not the storm. It was the sound of a dozen voices, a war cry that cut through the gale like a razor. Hoofbeats thundered, not from one horse, but from many a rhythmic drumming that seemed to make the very earth tremble. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene outside her window for a split second, etching a vision onto her memory. Mounted figures, dark and sleek against the storm, moving with impossible speed. At their head was a single rider, his form familiar, his purpose radiating like heat. Taz. Outside, confusion erupted into chaos. She heard Higgins's shocked shout, followed by the panicked cries of his men, the sharp crack of a rifle, then another. But these were overwhelmed by the thrum of bowstrings and the chilling whistles of arrows slicing through the rain-soaked air. The orange glow from the barn faltered as figures swarmed it, beating back the flames with blankets and well-aimed buckets of rainwater. Amelia could only lie there, a spectator to her own salvation, her body still in the merciless grip of labor. The cabin door burst open, not with the violence of an enemy, but with a quiet urgency. An older Navajo woman, her face a mask of serene concentration, entered, followed by two younger women. They moved with a calm purpose that was a stark contrast to the tempest outside. The older woman knelt by her bed, her hands gentle but firm as she checked Amelia's condition. She spoke in her own tongue, her voice a low, soothing chant, a melody of reassurance that transcended language. The world outside faded. The sounds of the fight became a distant backdrop to the immediate, overwhelming reality of childbirth. The Navajo women were a silent, efficient team. One wiped Amelia's brow with a cool, damp cloth. Another held her hand, a steady, strong anchor in the sea of pain. The elder woman guided her, her instructions conveyed through touch and tone, her presence an ancient calming force. The chaos outside and the miracle inside reached their crescendos simultaneously, as the last of Higgins's men fled into the stormy darkness, and Taz stood victorious amidst the rain and steam of the extinguished fire. Amelia gave one final guttural push. The pain receded, replaced by a sudden, shocking emptiness, followed by the thin, wondrous wail of a newborn baby. One of the younger women swaddled the infant in a soft, clean blanket and placed him in Amelia's arms. A son. He was small and perfect, his face red and wrinkled, his tiny fists clenched, as if in defiance of the violent world he had just entered. Tears streamed down Amelia's face, tears of relief, of exhaustion, of overwhelming, bone-deep love. The storm outside began to subside, its fury spent. The rain softened to a gentle patter. The thunder retreated, rumbling its discontent as it moved on across the plains. The door opened again. Taz stood on the threshold, silhouetted against the pale, pre-dawn light. His face and arms were streaked with rain and soot. He looked from Amelia to the swaddled child in her arms, and a profound stillness settled over him. The warrior was gone, and in his place was a man gazing upon a miracle he had arrived just in time to protect. His eyes met Amelia's, and in that silent, shared look, everything was understood. The debt was paid, a life for a life, and something new, something powerful and unbreakable had just been born in the heart of the storm. The dawn that broke was washed clean, the air crisp and smelling of rain and wet earth. The sky was a pale, tender blue, scrubbed of the storm's violence. The world felt new, fragile, and filled with a quiet sense of awe. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was one of hushed reverence. The Navajo women had cleaned the small space, tended to Amelia, and now sat quietly by the hearth, their presence a comforting, unobtrusive guard. Amelia, propped up against pillows, held her son. She had named him Robert, after his father, a small tribute to the man whose dream had brought her to this place. He was a piece of her past, but as she looked at his tiny sleeping face, she knew he was also the anchor to an entirely new and unforeseen future. Later that morning, Taz entered the cabin, accompanied by an older man of immense dignity. His hair was streaked with grey, and his face was a magnificent landscape of wrinkles, each line telling a story of seasons past and wisdom gained. He wore a simple silver medallion on his chest, a sign of his status. This was his father, the leader of their clan, Chief Keshji. They stood before her bed, their expressions solemn. Taz did not look at her directly, but at his father, a sign of deep respect. The chief's eyes, however, were fixed on Amelia, and they held no malice, only a deep, penetrating curiosity. He looked at the baby in her arms, and his stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. Chief Keshji began to speak, his voice a low, resonant baritone. He spoke in the Daine language, the words flowing like a river, ancient and powerful. Taz stood beside him, listening, and then he began to translate his English, halting but clear, learned Amelia realized in the long, silent hours he had spent listening to her talk in the cabin. My father. He says the story of what you did has been told to our people. Taz began his voice, low. When you found me, I was a man with one foot in the spirit world. My horse had thrown me in my fight with the great bear. My body was broken. You, a lone woman, did not see an enemy. You saw a man. You took me into your home, knowing the danger from your people and from mine. You used your medicine. You gave me your water and your food. You protected me from the man who wished you harm. He paused, taking a breath. He says this is an act of honor that is very large. You did not just save a warrior. You saved his son. You saved the future leader of our clan. This creates a debt that cannot be paid with horses or blankets. It is a debt of blood. Amelia listened, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. She clutched her son a little tighter. When I left, Taz continued translating his father's words. I left you the feather. This was my sign to my people. It told them who you were. It told them you were under my protection. We have been watching. From the hills we have seen your struggle. We saw the man poison your well. We saw your journeys to the stream. We waited because our laws are complex. But last night he came with fire. The time for waiting was over. The chief spoke again, his gaze unwavering. He says the man Higgins and his followers will trouble you no more. Their spirits were weak and they ran from the storm. They will not return to this valley. This land is now protected by my people. It is sacred ground because you bled here to bring forth new life, and my son's blood was healed here by your hand. A long silence filled the cabin. The gravity of the moment was immense. Amelia could feel the weight of centuries of tradition, of a culture she was only just beginning to comprehend. My father says Taz's voice was softer now, more personal, that you are a woman of great courage. You are a mother without a husband, a warrior without a clan. Your son is born of this land, but he is alone. Our people, we do not believe a child should be raised alone. A child needs a family, a clan, a people to be strong. Chief Keshji took a step forward. He looked directly into Amelia's eyes, and then Taz gave the final stunning translation. For your honor, and for the life of my son, which you returned to us, my father, our clan, we ask you to be his wife. We ask you to join our people. Your son will be my son. He will be a son of the Dain. He will never be alone. You will never be alone. This is not a demand. Taz added quickly, his own voice entering the translation. It is the highest honor we can offer. It is the only way the debt of blood can be paid, and an alliance of the blood can be made." Amelia was speechless. Her mind reeled. Marry Taz, leave her cabin, her world, everything she had ever known, and join a Navajo tribe. It was impossible. It was insane. She looked down at the baby in her arms. She saw his future stretching out before him, a life of hardship, of being an outcast, of struggling for every scrap in a world that would see him as nothing more than a poor widow's son. She thought of the loneliness, the constant fear, the biting poverty she faced. Then she looked up at Taz. She saw the quiet strength in his face, the fierce loyalty in his eyes. She saw the memory of his gentle care, his silent protection. She looked at his father, a man of immense power and wisdom, offering her not conquest, but sanctuary. He was offering her son a future she could never provide, a family, a people, an identity rooted in honor and strength. She was being offered a place to belong. A slow smile touched Amelia's lips, the first genuine smile of hope she'd had in months. It wasn't the future she had ever imagined, but perhaps it was the future she was always meant to have. She looked at Chief Keshji, and then her eyes settled on Taz. "Yes," she whispered, her voice clear and strong in the quiet cabin. "I will." The single word yes hung in the air as potent and final as a prayer. For a long moment, no one moved. Chief Keshji held Amelia's gaze, and a slow, deep nod was his response. A silent contract had been sealed. He turned to his son, placing a hand on Taz's shoulder, in a gesture of profound, paternal approval. The tension that had held Taz so rigidly seemed to dissolve, replaced by a quiet relief that softened the fierce lines of his face. He looked at Amelia, and for the first time, his eyes held not just respect or gratitude, but a promise of partnership. The cabin, which had been a place of terror and isolation, transformed into a gentle hive of activity. The Navajo women who had been silent observers now moved with a new purpose. They were no longer just helpers. They were kin, preparing one of their own for a journey home. They worked with a quiet efficiency that was both humbling and deeply comforting. One woman packed Amelia's few serviceable clothes and cooking pots, her choices practical and unsentimental. Another carefully prepared a travois, 2 long poles, harnessed to a gentle mare, creating a secure, comfortable nest of blankets and soft furs for Amelia and the baby. Amelia watched them, feeling a wave of exhaustion and surreal peace. Just yesterday, she was fighting for her life utterly alone. Now she was surrounded by a family she hadn't known existed. The older woman who had delivered her son, whose name she learned was Kinwani, meaning many goats, showed her how to securely wrap young Robert in a cradleboard, swaddling him in a way that was both secure and calming. The baby, sensing the peace, slept soundly. Before they departed, Taz indicated with a gesture that Amelia should take what she wished to remember. He understood she was leaving a life behind. She walked through the small one-room cabin that held the entirety of her past. She ran a hand over the rough-hewn table where she and Robert had shared their simple meals, his laughter a faint echo in her memory. She touched the stone hearth he had built, stone by stone, with his own hands. For a moment, grief threatened to overwhelm her. This cabin was a tomb of memory, a monument to a dream that had died. She knew with piercing certainty that she could not raise her son in a tomb. She did not take the rifle or the heavy tools. She took only 2 things. From a small wooden box, she retrieved a silver locket containing a tiny faded portrait of her husband, his face young and full of hope. The other was the crimson-tipped feather Taz had given her. She tucked them both safely into a pocket. One was the closing of a chapter, the other the beginning of a new one. Stepping out into the bright morning, she found the entire party ready. Taz helped her onto the mare that would pull the travois, his touch steady and respectful. He then mounted his own powerful horse, taking his place beside her. Chief Keshji sat at the head of the procession, a silent, dignified leader. With a soft command, they began to move not west toward the white settlements, but east toward the rising sun and the heart of the Dine territory. As they crested the first rise, Amelia looked back one last time. From this distance, the cabin looked small and insignificant, a tiny, lonely box on the vast canvas of the land. The burned-out shell of the barn was a dark scar beside it. A life of solitary struggle. She felt a pang of sadness, but no regret. She turned her gaze forward. Before them, the land opened up a vista of breathtaking beauty and scale she had never truly appreciated. The mountains, once a distant barrier, were now a destination, a promise. The wind carried the scent of sage and damp earth. Beside her, Taz rode with an easy confidence, his presence a solid, reassuring shield. In the cradleboard, her son slept on his life just beginning. The path ahead was unknown, carved through canyons and across plains she had never seen, leading to a life she couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in a very long time, she was not walking it alone. And so Amelia Rosewood's story didn't end in that lonely cabin. It began. She didn't lose her identity. She found a new one woven into the rich tapestry of the Dine. She became a bridge between two worlds, her son a symbol of a new kind of frontier, one built not on conflict, but on mutual respect and unexpected love. She found her strength not in solitude, but in community, and her home not in a plot of land, but in the heart of a people who saw her honor and matched it with their own. What did you think of Amelia's incredible journey? Could you have made the same choice in her position? Let us know in the comments below. Stories like these of courage and unexpected connections in the Old West are the heart of what we do. If you were moved by this tale, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe for more true-life dramas from the pages of history.